Welcome back. So, last unit was a trip, to say the least. We saw this big crusade organized, this time involving royalty, for better or worse, and probably worse, and reframed completely, sent to the Holy Land. And along it, these parallel movements, the Vendish Crusade, about which I talked in the last unit, and then also this sort of English involvement in the Reconquista outside Lisbon, which is an interesting forecast for what's going to happen with the Reconquista and crusading in general that we'll get to discuss a little more in Unit 11. In the meantime, returning to the Holy Land, of course, the Second Crusade leaves Jerusalem in a terrible position. Most of its local allies abandon it, right? They've proven themselves unreliable as allies. They've proven Nur ad-Din correct, that they will attack any Muslim, indiscriminate of political orientation, of ethnicity, anything like that. They really have shown the Crusaders to be the enemy of Islam, and this has advanced the cause of Nur ad-Din's jihad significantly. As I said before, the Kingdom of Jerusalem is in a significantly worse position after the Second Crusade, which was organized nominally to help it, than it was before it. So, what better way to follow up such a disaster of bad decision-making than with a disaster of bad decision-making? As you'll get to see, it's an interesting thought process that leads the Kingdom of Jerusalem to attack Egypt, Fatimid Egypt, right? The major rival of the Seljuk Turks locally for power. Here we get to see some of the dynamics play out, the complications of having independent military forces, and what do you do, especially when those disagree with each other on the appropriate strategy. The Templars and the Hospitallers, the two largest of the military orders and most significant, not in an agreement about how to approach this Egyptian problem, if you will. But either way, the decision to attack Egypt backfires immensely. As you'll see, this upsets the political balance in the region substantially. One of the things that allowed the Kingdom of Jerusalem to exist, despite being outnumbered by all of its local opponents, is the fact that both the Fatimids in Egypt, the Shiite Fatimids in Egypt, and the Seljuk Turks were a little bit afraid to launch a major campaign for fear of exposing themselves to an offense against the other. But by attacking Fatimid Egypt, really drives the two enemies into something of an alliance against a common enemy. The Fatimid Caliph will appeal to Nur ad-Din for help. As you'll see, Nur ad-Din sends a general, Shirkuh, who betrays the Caliph, and long story short, power ultimately falls to his nephew, Salah ad-Din. And Saladin will end up inheriting Nur ad-Din's burgeoning little empire in the north and Egypt, and create the Ayyubid dynasty. So now, the Kingdom of Jerusalem will find itself surrounded on all sides by a hostile enemy, Salah ad-Din, who also inherits this drive, this message for jihad against the Crusaders. It really stands no chance. The only thing protecting it is a sort of political mechanism here, the treaty that gets set up, as you'll see, and that itself will fall apart largely due to political infighting in Jerusalem. This, by the way, the context for the Kingdom of Heaven movie that you're going to have to review here. So pay close attention to all of those details. Anyway, as you'll see, Jerusalem does fall to Salah ad-Din in 1187 in the wake of the Battle of Hattin, which was a disaster. And Salah ad-Din distinguishes himself, and this will go down throughout history, by how he treats the population of Jerusalem in the wake of the conquest. When Jerusalem was conquered by Christians, as you saw, a massacre of unprecedented scale, maybe as many as 70,000 people, to cleanse the population, if you will, and the Crusaders sort of re-inhabit it. Absolute disaster, absolutely shocking to observers in the Islamic world, and for most people, a cause for great celebration in the Latin West, as you saw. When Salah ad-Din conquers Jerusalem, however, you'll see he's really extremely accommodating towards the population, allowing the Christians to pay a fairly nominal fee and make their escape unmolested to the coast. And this will earn him such a positive reputation in hindsight in the Christian world that he will become a figure emblematic of this ideal of chivalry, of, sort of the prime, characteristics of a Christian warrior, even though, of course, Saladin's not Christian, but a very sympathetic reception in European stories that will get passed down into the Romantic era, into the modern period, actually more interest in some ways in the European world than in the Middle East, where his status, his ethnicity as a Kurd, perhaps, leads to a less favorable reception until much later in the modern period, as we'll see in the final episode, if you will, of our course. So, Jerusalem has fallen, right? Shocking. You would expect this to lead to the largest crusade of all, and at first it does. You get all of the major heavyweights of Western Europe involved in this massive crusade to the Holy Land. You find, Frederick Barbarossa, perhaps the most powerful singular ruler, who leads an army maybe equivalent in size to the entire First Crusade, just under his own leadership. Philip Augustus, a rising star in European politics, who will only continue to rise after this. Richard the Lionheart of England from the Robin Hood stories, and those two very close together, as you'll read about. But despite the enthusiasm for the crusade to start, the scale of the response, interestingly, the fact that it dwindles so quickly might suggest some degree of ambivalence towards it back in Europe, some kind of dwindling interest in crusading. When Frederick dies crossing a river, the political concerns of what will follow back in Germany is going to lead his entire army to retreat, and they do not re-engage. When Philip Augustus and Richard have a falling out and things don't go well at first in the crusade for Philip, he takes his French forces and retreats back to France, where he'll actually put his efforts and armies to use, conquering back land for the crown of France away from Richard, who had inherited the Angevin Empire's holdings in France. Richard is then left alone to fight Saladin, and the two will have an extended struggle, as you'll see, and a bit of a compromise at the end. But one of the interesting things to note about the way this resolves, really about Richard's perspective on it all, is that Richard comes to the conclusion, fascinatingly, that in order for the Kingdom of Jerusalem ever to be stable and protected, Egypt has to come under Christian hands. He lays out this idea that you have to take Egypt in order for Jerusalem to be reconquered. You should start in Egypt, and that will define the course of the next several crusades. The Fourth Crusade, the plan at least, is to go to Egypt. For reasons we'll see in the next unit, they never make it. The Fifth Crusade is straight to Egypt. The Sixth Crusade, which takes an interesting turn that we'll also get to see later on, again, aimed at Egypt. Egypt becomes the primary target of the Crusades, just based on the strategic consideration. And of course, the possible wealth of Egypt may have played a factor as well. One final consideration from the Third Crusade is this purported alliance that arises between Byzantium and Saladin, supposedly a secret alliance to undermine the Crusader effort somewhat, and it's reflective of a decline in Byzantine Latin relations ever since the First Crusade. As you'll recall, the First Crusade was launched nominally to help Byzantium, even though the goals did not align, and the Crusaders had worked out a deal with Alexios Komnenos that they would reconquer all land from Byzantium. Obviously, they betrayed that message pretty quickly on, and over the course of the First Crusade, relations disintegrated. Neither side was particularly fond of the other. The feelings of the Great Schism may be part of it, but the cultural difference is bigger. Alexios's daughter, Anna Komnena, had written all these perspectives on the Crusaders, showing how uncivilized they were in comparison to her Byzantine sensibilities. Well, relations had not improved significantly since then, although there was some degree of cooperation, but now apparently by the Third Crusade, if the reports are to be believed, you have this alliance for Byzantium with its former enemies. In fact, you also saw in the Second Crusade this suggestion that Louis ought to go invade Byzantium, which is really quite an amazing suggestion, but it gets rejected. Anyway, the reason I highlight all of this is because The Fourth Crusade ultimately, though not intentionally at first, but ultimately will pitch crusaders against the Byzantine world, which is surprising, but it is in some ways the culmination of a trend that's been building for quite some time. So, enjoy this week's readings, and I will check in with you again in the next unit, as always. Have fun.